Welcome to Board Game Binge, the place where we bring you bite-sized, bingeable board game content from across the industry. I'm your host, James Staley, and in this episode, we're chatting with Rob Fun Sale, owner and creative director of Pleasant Company Games, a South African tabletop game publisher. His newest campaign, Ancient Terrible Things Reawakened, is in its final day on Kickstarter. Rob, welcome to the binge. How you doing?
James, wonderful to have you. Wonderful to be here, in fact. Thank you.
Oh, it's great to have. No, we were just saying before we went on air, I'm going to say this for the audience. You're here from South Africa. This is the first person I think I've had from your continent, quite frankly, on the podcast. So this is exciting for me because I just like this idea of getting to talk with people from around the world that all share the same passion. Man, it's so cool. And it brings me such joy in this industry when I get this opportunity. So thank you for agreeing to come on the podcast.
No, it's a pleasure. It's nice, as you say, to see and meet people from different continents, different voices in the same industry, and different ideas that sort of brought to the table.
Yeah, it is cool. You know, it really is a global community. And you see this when you even go to like, game shows, or if people are going to Gen Con, and, this coming weekend, I'm going to Breakout Con here in Canada. And you'll see some faces that you've met in the industry who you've only seen virtually, right? And then we see them in person. It's like, oh my God,
Absolutely.
like, give me a hug. Gosh, it's just this big, huge family, and it's just such joy. So let's start off with talking about you and your company, Pleasant Company Games. You've been in this industry now for, I think, over 10 years. Is that the case?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, we started as a sort of offshoot of Pleasant Company Studios, which is my sort of animation production company. My background's in advertising, so I've done a lot of work through the sort of ad industries, and sort of this became a sort of offshoot, sort of sub brand to explore tabletop games and publish cardboard products. I mean, I love cardboard and I love interactive cardboard, and I think those two things is really my passion, and I think that's how it started. So yes, 10 years ago was almost to the day, and in fact, this campaign is in many ways a celebration. It's a 10th anniversary of that journey, by also re-exploring that first game that was published back then.
Wow. And are you still running like the animation side of the company too? Like, is it still kind of two businesses you're running, the gaming side and then the animation studio?
Absolutely. I mean, I think you yourself, as a publisher, are aware that I think this industry is very much one of passion and enthusiasm, and many of us have sort of side passions where we, the tabletop games, certainly it has its audience, and we have our core audience, but are still very much involved in animation and the advertising marketing side of things. But they do have nice crossover and parallels between the two. So, for instance, doing a Kickstarter campaign or just launching a new game, I do bring to the table a lot of that experience in the advertising space.
That's cool. And do you focus mainly on the board game industry, or do you literally do animation for anything?
My deep background beyond sort of tabletop games is I was an animation director, and working very much in the advertising space. So I've specialized in predominantly sort of short form commercials, motion identity, motion graphics, that side of that sort of space. And then a lot of 2D animation, being sort of traditional hand-drawn, flash-based animation. And all of those sort of things actually led into my passion for tabletop games, a sort of love of analog product. And I think board games is really the ultimate analog product.
It's crazy. Two things I want to say. One is the fact that this is kind of like a side passion, right? And I think a lot of people in this industry, that's why they're doing it. They're not doing it for the money. I can tell you that. There's not many people driving Lambos making board games, right? Like there's usually something else they're doing. But it's kind of looking at transferable skills, right? And we talk a lot about this in the podcast of people that have experience in, whether it's project management, which really helps with Kickstarters, or in your case, animation and design and things like this really play in well into telling the story, right? And really building that experience for the user. Often when I talk to people who are on the animation side or in the electronic side, it's almost like a natural draw to the analog side, right? And to the more tactile, and kind of having that dichotomy, right? Of having, okay, over here, I'm going to have the electronics and I'm going to be in front of a computer screen for 8 hours working. And on this side, I'm going to put all that to the side and I'm going to pick stuff up, right? Things I can actually interact with on a table and immerse myself in that. And it's almost like a different environment altogether, yet they're still kind of connected, which I find kind of interesting.
Absolutely. I mean, you talk about that tactility of picking items up. I think there's, the haptics of board games. That moving pieces around, and certainly, what I love is exploring materials, and I've tried to do that a lot, especially with this new version of Ancient Terrible Things, of having multiple different materials. Having denim and wood and card and cardboard and having all those sort of tactile experiences to actually play around with.
Yeah, and it's cool to see innovation in this industry as well, right? Like, and I was talking with my design partner again, my brother, Adam, the other night, and we were just spitballing as we were kind of playing some games, and I was like, oh, what if we did something like this, right? And what if we took something weird from like another area, and like, what if the board was furry, for example? Like, just spitballing like abstract things, but sometimes some pretty cool things come out of that. One is, we'll talk to it in a bit, is your riverboat being lit up, right? I think that's super cool. So we're gonna get into that in a second too, which I think is really innovative for the industry. When you got into this industry, what was like? There's a natural draw, obviously, with in connection with animation and design and things like that. But just playing board games themselves, is this something that's been part of your life, like, since the beginning, or is this something you got into later on?
I think originally, I mean, when I was a sort of a young teenager, I was very passionate about board games. So I'm a kid of the 80s. So back in those days, it was the sort of Games Workshop was really well known for its sort of 2000 AD offshoot board games, and they had a board game called Blockmania and an expansion called Mega Mania that was based on the Judge Dredd universe. I don't know if you're aware of that IP. And it was this crazy board game where you were essentially in the sort of far future, and each person had a apartment block, sort of futuristic apartment block, and then you'd have a block war and you'd attack the other apartment block next door. And the object of the game was to try and get your opponent's apartment block to sort of collapse, and you would sort of set fire, and then it would cause structural damage. And it was a very old-fashioned 80s style board game, because there was lots of chits that you had to keep track of, spreading fire and spreading structural damage. But I absolutely loved this board game, and it was hugely influential at that time when I was sort of 11, 12. And then life moves on, and you go into high school, and I lost interest in board games, and I moved on to other things. And I remember walking back into a board game store at about the age of 30, so sort of 15, 16 years later, and not realizing that board games still existed. And it was very interesting. It felt almost like rediscovering an old friend and I was so amazed that board games not only still existed, that they had sort of evolved and were sort of very much alive.
Yeah.
And that's kind of when my passion was almost rekindled, to start exploring them again. And then, a couple of more years passed, and at that point I was still very immersed in the animation field. And then sort of my mid-30s, I took a break from that field completely. I went on a sort of a small sabbatical. I went traveling through Southeast Asia, and traveling through sort of the Mekong area. And at that point, it sort of all kind of coalesced. I suddenly realized, like, I actually always wanted to make board games. That's actually the field that really drives it was a strange one. It literally kind of hit me as a like a light out of the clouds.
Yeah.
And I was sitting in this area. I was sitting in this sort of jungle river environment, and it all kind of came together. I thought, I actually want to make a sort of a jungle river Indiana Jones board game, and I was in the right place at the right time, and that's kind of when it rekindled. So it's been a sort of 15-year journey since then, and here we are now.
It's really cool to see the emergence of the hobby.
Absolutely.
When I think back to late '90s, I think everyone assumed board game industry was dead, right? Yeah, the gaming consoles were taking
Mm.
off, graphics were getting so much better on games. They're becoming more immersive, more story based, and most kids were just be sitting in front of a TV, right? And then at that time, you had like your five main toy publishers that controlled the industry, and this whole kind of globalization when that occurred and gave people access to smaller runs and being able to work direct with factories overseas, that combined with the crowdfunding where people could get pre-interest set up and quite frankly prepayment for games before they actually go and manufacture it, that was the game changer, right? That took all the
Absolutely.
kids like you and I, right, from the 80s, had all these dreams of things that we would create. Man, if this is my company, I would do this and I would create that. Or our kind of homebrew versions of Monopoly or homebrew versions of Risk and the different types of stock ticker and these kind of games. And now we're in a position where, oh, I can go and do that. That's no longer just a dream. That's something that's very much a reality. It just takes me going and doing it, right? So I have global access now where I can go and manufacture a very small run. I mean, there's factories out there that'll make 500 games if you need to make that small of a quantity. Crowdfunding. Now the financial risk, although there's still some risk there in developing a game, but it's not what it was, right? It wasn't okay, go and get a loan from the bank or go get a bunch of investors and put all the money on the table and then roll the dice and see if this is a good game. You can actually pre-test, pre-market, pre-conceptualize with your audience to say, okay, is this something that's going to work or not? And you're going to know because they're either going to back you or they're not going to back you, right? And then you take those funds
Absolutely.
and go and
Yeah.
make the game. And I think that the most recent tier that we're seeing of that now, now that this whole hobby's exploded and you've got thousands of independent publishers now that are creating games and they keep building upon each other and reiterating and we're getting more like innovation, quite frankly, and you're really seeing games evolve now beyond what they were even 10 years ago. But the one element I think I'd add on top of that now is also the access to talent globally, right?
Mm.
And
Mm.
now, even go back 5 years ago when I first was getting into the industry, I was trying to find illustrators for my games, and I was going literally to local Comic Cons and walking the aisle where the guys were the artists that were doing comics and things like that, and trying to find artists for games. And that is now no longer a regional thing either. Now there's Facebook groups dedicated to finding artists from around the world. And I mean, I've had games where I've had people from Colombia, I've had people from Brazil, had people from Sweden working on my games, right? So now you've really got a global market you can tap into, which I think really has changed that game and making it even more accessible for people who are looking to get into the industry. There really is very few barriers left, I would say, to enter if you've got a good idea for a game.
No, I think you're spot on. I mean, what you're mentioning about the sort of Kickstarter, I mean, how seminal that has been, or crowdfunding has been for this industry. If you look at just the numbers on Kickstarter for the amount of funds that they get in on the tabletop game category alone, it's very high. It's almost three quarters, I think, of their actual drive. Is that industry, that field is directly sort of feeding from that crowdfunding space. And what you're saying also about the sort of pre visualization or kind of MVP, or sort of seeing if people are interested in your product, that is the biggest barrier to entry for board games. Is that, as you say, you could have a great idea, you could have a great artist, great prototype, but that sort of 50 or sort of 30 to $50,000 that you need for manufacturing, that's a large sort of hill to climb if you don't know if anyone wants what you're making.
Yeah.
And crowdfunding has just completely opened that up to really sort of putting up what remember GMT, I think, did it many years ago. GMT, the game company, had something called the P500. I think they still do have the P500, and it's the basic concept that you have to have 500 pre-orders, and then you're ready to move forward. And I think Kickstarter and crowdfunding has really opened up that concept and really run with it. So now you can go, well, And what's interesting about Kickstarters is that I was speaking to someone recently who had a failed Kickstarter, and they were very frustrated by it, and saying, and I said, well, the fact that it failed was a good thing, because it did exactly what it needed to do. Is that you took something to pre-market, and the market responded, and you can now realize, well, something's not right, and I have to go back to the drawing board. It didn't cost you anything,
Yeah.
And you can now sort of adjust and then go back to a crowdfunding platform. So it is a successful in that sort of level. Yeah.
Even if I go back, even those 5 years ago with that first game, and I remember knocking on doors and going store to store trying to get the friendly local game stores to carry it, and what a grind that was, and how much surprising resistance there was for local game stores to support local publishers, right? Like, you would think it would be obvious that they would say, oh yeah, you're local, no problem, let us give us at least one copy, right? But there's such a resistance because the distributors had most of these guys locked up, where they're like, well, it's just easier for me just to work with my 2 distributors because I got a whole list of games. I just go down and just check the boxes, and then the whole order arrives on a skid, right? I don't have to worry about talking to different people and things like this.
Right.
Well, the Amazons now of the world and the Shopifys allows you to even sidestep that and go direct to consumer, right? So there are no barriers. So if anybody's sitting back listening that has an idea for games, is, wow, wouldn't it be nice to do this someday? I wish I could do X, Y, Z. You can, right? You can. You just got to go and
Absolutely.
You just got to go and do it. And there are oodles of resources out there to help you get there. And I mean, we always talk about Stonemaier Games with Jamie Stegmaier on this podcast, but StoneMaierGames.com is a library of how to go to market with your game, and it's free. You just go to his website and just start going through, and he even categorizes the blogs to make it very easy to navigate his site too. So there's really no excuses not to pursue your dreams if it's something you want to do. Yeah.
And that globalization that you're mentioning is absolutely spot on. I mean, I think without being, I mean, I'm a case study of that. I mean, I'm a South African, down here we have a very small board game market. I mean, a couple of cases would fulfill the orders for this territory.
Yeah.
So it's very much about it, sort of tapping into that globalization and the potential of the internet to reach markets.
Yeah.
And it still tickles me when we run a small web store back in South Africa just for promo cards and very much kind of just very collectible stuff that gets shipped from our studio down here. And it tickles me when I see an order come in from Peru or Colombia or Japan, just for 10-year-old Rob to think that one day you could actually just do a lot of that stuff off your desktop computer and have an audience in these far-flung places through the power of the internet and things like Kickstarter and crowdfunding. I think it's amazing. So there should be no barrier to entry. I mean, the only barrier to entry is really just to make a good game.
Or or your will to do it, right?
Or your will to do it, yeah. And you certainly have to put in the many hundreds of hours to do the project. But as far as access to market goes, I think it's there.
I often say to people, like, someone's like, I don't know how to get started. The best way to get started is to get started, right?
Yeah,
like
absolutely.
that is do something, anything, one thing a day. Even if it's today, I'm going to make a list, or, today I'm going to watch 2 videos on how to do, find a, how to find an artist, or today I'm going to go on and I'm going to look at Facebook groups that are focused on game design. Just pick one thing a day. You will find that if you do that, before you know it, you've got a game that's ready to go to market. You said the game industry in South Africa was small. Are we seeing local game shops show up at all? Like, is there board game cafes or anything like that there? Is that starting to manifest itself, or?
We have a few. I mean, I live in Cape Town, which is a relatively small town, but it's the sort of it's becoming the economic powerhouse of South Africa.
Sure.
Because we're having quite serious loads. We're having quite serious power problems here right now. But that's a very different discussion. But so Cape Town itself has a few board game stores and 1 or 2 sort of board game cafes. But across the whole city, we may be looking at sort of 4, 5, 6 in total. So it's a very small market here. It's very niche.
Mm-hmm.
South Africa has quite a serious sort of inequality sort of demographic. So the sort of middle class, or those who can afford board games, is probably only sort of 10% of the
Mm,
population. And then of that 10%, those who are into board games might only be sort of 0 point however many percent. So it's really is a sort of very minuscule space.
yeah.
And because it's such a small market, I think there's even a smaller market for sort of indie publishers like myself, which is quite niche. The work that I do is it's quite
Yeah.
punk rock in its sort of styling. So it's kind of it's a very much an acquired taste.
Yeah.
And though I do get supported locally, as far as I'm aware, I'm the only hobby game publisher in South Africa. So there is support for that, being sort of a sort of trailblazer on that space.
Yeah.
But certainly not. It's not a big enough market to build a board game business
Sure.
locally. And I very much rely on the US mainland and the European market, for a proper sustainable retail audience.
Yeah. With this game, Ancient Terrible Things, I'm going to show the page here for the people that are watching either live or on the replay. First of all, I want to congratulate you. I'm going to put this in Canadian dollars because it's the only way I can see it, but you've hit $92,623 on a goal of 41,000. So you've gone way over your goal, more than double your goal. You still got 27 hours to go, so just a day left in your campaign. 1,393 backers. I want to congratulate you on that first and foremost. That is huge. Getting close, and you're probably going to finish. If you don't hit it, then certainly in the late pledges and things like that, you'll cross 100,000, which is a huge milestone. So I want to congratulate you on that. And I know that this is actually done even better than the original iteration of this game, I believe, as well. Has it not?
No, absolutely. I mean, look, we were picking up a lot of the audience of the original game, which is very heartwarming. It's a 10-year-old game.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a strange one because it's very quite divisive. There's some who don't like the game at all, and there's some who really love this game. And so we've really kept a lot of the audience of the original guys have come back, and done things which are probably a small publisher can get away with, which a bigger publisher might ignore, which is trying to offer upgrade packs to the first edition owners.
Yeah.
Which is a huge amount of sort of homework of trying to kind of separate a games and from a development perspective, going, okay, how do I kind of cut into this, try and do a new edition that I not be limited to what I want to do, but at the same time still bring the previous backers along on this journey and not make them feel that they have to keep buying the same game over again. The core mechanic of the game has very much remained the same. It's sort of some call it sort of a super Yahtzee Cthulhu game.
Mm-hmm.
But the core mechanic is a great one, and I really wanted to iterate that and iterate it with the game designer. So there's been different iterations of this game through the years. There was a first edition, there was a second edition, there was a offshoot game called Conjure, and now this sort of folds together all the best ideas from all of those into sort of like a final definitive version of this game.
It definitely looks cool on the table, and I've shown some of the imagery here on screen. I love the artwork. It's cool. And so, as I think it was Rado runs through. I was watching his video, and he did a great overview. And he was talking a little bit about how you guys have streamlined things a bit from the first iteration. What kind of changes did you make to this game? Or I guess first, let's maybe tell people what this game is like. So it's got this kind of the Super Yahtzee style. How have you kind of integrated that mechanic into this game? Like, what is the core essence of the story behind this?
So the game it's a jungle adventure, sort of Cthulhu style. I mean, I'm using Cthulhu, but the game is not a Cthulhu game.
Sure.
And I've gone out of my way to make sure that it's own world. But you're sort of exploring this jungle river, and you're having various encounters with sort of villains and horrors and pitfalls and all sorts of various things. And the core mechanic of the game is sort of based on poker dice or Yahtzee, where you're using sort of 5 dice to create combinations, pairs, 3 of a kind, runs. But what makes it slightly different from sort of classic Yahtzee is that the dice combinations that you roll are the minimum value that you require. So, for instance, if a card requires you to have a pair of dice showing 2, that could be 2 2s, 3 3s, 4 4s. So that makes the game quite interesting, where you're trying to sort of up level your dice as much as you can.
Mm.
The other interesting thing about the game is that it has a ratchet where the cards get progressively harder as you get further on in the game, and each card has a dice combination that needs to be beaten to points.
Mm-hmm.
But whether or not you beat that card, there's a matrix of dice combinations that you can use to get resources in the game, and those resources are represented by tokens, and they do various things. They let you play powerful cards from your hand, and buy certain things from the shop. So it has this sort of resource management aspect to it, press your luck management, and sort of a light sort of Euro flavoring to the whole thing as well. So it covers all of that sort of stuff, and then it's wrapped up in a very crazy Cthulhu style world.
And so what is some of the streamlining you did or changes you made from this version, from the prior version?
I think the core thing that we did was the game in the previous version had these sort of 6 locations that you would go to, and each location you would essentially do something at that location, and you would go through your turn, and your turn had multiple steps, and you would get to buy things in a turn, and so everyone had a sort of very long turn, which was fine in sort of a 2-player game. 3-player game, it was fine, but the downtime became a little bit excessive in a sort of 4-player game. So the idea was to really streamline that, to actually make all of these locations in the game that have a dual action. So very much a situation where you would go there, you would take some bonus action, and then everyone around the table would get a secondary action. And that kind of really opened things up, where we suddenly started folding in all the various things that you would do in those phases. We'd put them onto these locations. So it became much more of a tactical action selection game. When you went somewhere, for instance, if you're going to buy from the shop, it's going to happen now when that player goes to that location. If you wanted to refresh your hand of feat cards, it would happen at a specific location when someone goes to that location. So the game has become, so the number of phases in a player's turn is much more streamlined, and there's a lot more interactivity during everyone's turn. And that's really solved a lot of the issues that I had with the first edition.
Talk to me about this dice tower. It is so cool.
So the backstory of the dice tower is, and I have to give credit to a fan called Jonah Jello, I think is his surname. I might be correct on his surname. But during the first edition of the game, this fan posted a balsa wood dice tower that he had made to BGG of the riverboat, and he had designed this looked very different from when I finally got into it, but the penny kind of dropped. I never really saw the riverboat that was in the game as an illustration. I'd never seen it as a dice tower until this fan posted this homemade balsa wood dice tower, and I was like, oh my goodness, it does look exactly like a dice tower. And that was 10 years ago.
Yeah.
But it always sort of sat in the back of my mind. I was like, well, I must get around to designing a cardboard dice tower. And then when this new iteration came around and we were in development on the design and the artwork and planning to do this new version, I thought this is the time for this dice tower. And of course, like any project, it's sort of metastasized, and what started off as just a simple dice tower then just became a dice tower that you could look through the windows, because we wanted to make sure that you could look into the cabins of the dice tower.
Yeah.
And then once we could look through the cabins of the dice tower, I was like, well, look, now I want to see what's in those cabins. So then we have to bring lights into that cabin. So all of this stuff is sort of now it's become this fully lit dice tower where you can put, the Kickstarter will come with sort of an LED light strip and a battery pack, and you can run your LED lights through the cabin. And it adds to the story. It adds to the story of Ancient Terrible Things, where the dice tower is, not the dice tower, but the riverboat is, in many ways, is the protagonist of the game, or certainly the central location in the game.
Yeah.
So to kind of expand the story through this dice tower was quite fun to do, and go, okay, what's in the captain's cabin? If I look through the window, what's lying on their bed, and what's in and sort of design all those props. And of course, that's kind of metastasized again during the Kickstarter campaign, where people were like, well, we want to see props on this riverboat. So we've gone back to the punch boards and gone, okay, well, how much space have we got left on these punch boards? And we've opened it up to the Kickstarter backers. And now we've got all sorts of props that we're going to add. We've got gaffs lying on the deck of the riverboat. We've got tentacles coming up the side. We've got tires stuck on the front. So it's been a really fun central object to kind of to sort of celebrate the game around, and to be sort of a central focus. It's this thing that sort of sits in the middle of the game. So yeah, it's been a fun project.
Certainly adds to the ambiance, and that is included in the deluxe version of the game, I think, or you can buy it as an add-on, I think, right?
So what we've done is we've split it up into a couple of tiers, but the deluxe is kind of sort of the all-in, which includes a riverboat dice tower, but it's obviously available as a separate product for for players who are buying the upgrade kit and they want it just as an item. And of course, also once again during the Kickstarter, a lot of people came onto the Kickstarter and said, "Look, I don't like this game. I'm not interested, but the riverboat rocks. How do I get the riverboat?" So now we've tried to change the deck of the riverboat so that there will be a version that's got the scenario matrix, so sort of the dice matrix that you have in the game.
Yeah.
Because you can sort of take your dice out of the dice tower and then put them on the front of the boat if you wanted to play it that way, for instance. But then to also have a deck that's blank and then make the riverboat something that players can have as a separate dice tower that's game standalone, that you can play it generically with any other adventure game. Yeah.
No, super cool. What are you guys working on after this? Like, so this game is wrapping up in the next day. Obviously, there's a lot of work and then getting that produced, and your timelines seem quite aggressive. So I think by the end of this year, you're actually shipping. Is there, as a publisher, you have another title on the go, or what's next for you guys?
Well, it's going to be an interesting one. Is that as a small publisher, as an indie publisher, these games are largely the work of myself and the game designer.
Yeah.
So every version of these games, they certainly, I feel like I'm trying to hit 80%, but there's always that 10%. And once the games have obviously in market and they've had a minimum print run, once they've been alive and they've been living in this space for a while, it's very interesting to see what players come back with and say, well, it would be wonderful if this could happen. And understand, I'm not using the sort of audience as playtesters. We obviously playtest the games aggressively, but once games have lived for many years, we like to go, well, I quite like going back to the materials. So the next game is likely to be the second game that we did, which was a game called Snowblind, Race to the Pole, which was a very different, it doesn't have a fantasy theme at all. It's in fact sort of a survival, an Antarctic survival game based on the Amundsen, Robert Scott race for the South Pole sort of 100 years ago. So that game I'd love to explore again. I'm not going to give away too much at this point. We've got some kind of very interesting ways of doing a second version of that. But it feels in some ways I'm sort of on a carousel and I'm now going back to the beginning and starting to look at this material again. So that's likely to be the next project.
Oh, that's awesome. Well, again, I want to congratulate you on this this game. For people that are listening, if you want to check this game out, I'm going to put a link in the show notes. Or quite frankly, you can just go to Kickstarter and search Ancient Terrible Things. Either way, we'll get you there. Check it out. At the very least, check it out to see this dice tower these guys have created. This riverboat looks awesome. The artwork is beautiful. It's cool and it's inspiring to talk to somebody in South Africa about their journey. And I want to thank you so much for your time, Rob, and wish you all the best in this coming year.
Thanks, James. It was wonderful to chat about stuff. Thank you.
This has been an episode of the Board Game Binge podcast, hosted by James Staley, produced by James Staley and Mike Bruner, with original music by Nick Smith. If you would like to watch these interviews live, simply subscribe to our YouTube channel, Board Game Binge, and you'll get access to live interviews, giveaways, and interesting board game content from across the industry. I can't wait for you to join us. See you next time.